My name's Sam, and I used to deliver packages for the post office in Pine Hollow, Kentucky. This story happened on a Thursday last summer, and I swear I'll never forget it. It was one of those gloomy days where the air feels heavy, like the sky's been threatening rain for hours but never delivers. I'd spent the morning doing my usual rounds, dropping off letters, chatting with a few neighbors, but by noon, I was back at the post office to load up for the afternoon deliveries. That's when I saw it. A small package, wrapped in plain brown paper, sitting on the counter. The label was handwritten in shaky letters. Lane Residence. I froze when I read it. Everyone in Pine Hollow knows the Lane Residence. It's an abandoned farmhouse at the edge of town, right where the woods begin. The family that lived there disappeared 30 years ago. One night, they were just gone. No note, no explanation. Theories ranged from a runaway family to something darker, but no one really knew. The house has been sitting there, empty and rotting, ever since. And now, someone was sending a package there? Judy, our postmaster, handed me the delivery list. Lane Residence is on your route today, she said, like it was no big deal. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her to send it back, but I didn't. Part of me was curious, and the rest of me figured I'd just drop it off on the porch and leave. Easy enough, right? By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the sky had darkened. The woods seemed thicker than usual, the branches heavy with damp leaves that brushed against my truck as I drove past. My radio was playing static, so I turned it off and rolled down the window to let in some fresh air. The smell of rain lingered, though it hadn't started yet. The Lane farmhouse appeared at the end of the gravel road, just as decrepit as I remembered. The windows were broken, the roof sagging, and ivy climbed up the sides like it was trying to swallow the whole place. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up, and I killed the engine. The package was small and light in my hands as I stepped out of the truck. The air felt colder here, like the sun had decided this part of town didn't deserve its warmth. There was a smell, too. Something metallic and sour, like rusted metal left in the rain too long. I shrugged it off and started up the overgrown path toward the house. The porch creaked under my boots, and when I bent down to leave the package, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly open, not enough to see inside, but enough to feel like someone, or something, had been there recently. "Hello?" I called, more out of habit than anything. My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the silence. No response. I hesitated. Common sense told me to leave the package and go, but my curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I was nudging the door open with my foot. The inside of the house smelled like mold and old wood. Dust hung in the air, catching what little light seeped through the dirty windows. Furniture was still there, covered in white sheets that had turned gray over the years. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I placed the package on a small table near the door, my eyes scanning the room. There were family photos on the walls, their faces faded and smudged. I couldn't help but wonder who'd sent the package and why. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. Words I couldn't make out, but definitely a voice. "Hello," I called again, my voice shaking now. The whispering stopped. Every instinct in my body told me to leave, but instead, I stepped further inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the whispers started again, closer this time. It wasn't just one voice now. It sounded like several, overlapping and murmuring in a language I didn't understand. My heart was pounding as I made my way toward the stairs. The second floor was darker. The windows up here boarded up. The whispers grew louder as I climbed, until they seemed to echo all around me. I stopped at the top of the staircase, frozen. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure. She was wearing a white dress, torn and dirty, her back turned to me. Her hair was long and matted, hanging down over her shoulders. She wasn't moving, just standing there, her head tilted slightly to one side. "Ma'am?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. My legs felt like lead as I took a step forward. The floor creaked and she turned around. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were too big, her mouth stretched into a smile that didn't belong on a human face. Her skin was pale and cracked, like an old porcelain doll. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." Her voice wasn't just hers, it was all the whispers combined, layered on top of each other in a way that made my ears ring. Before I could react, she started moving toward me, not walking, but gliding like her feet weren't even touching the ground. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself as I turned and ran. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head and drowning out my thoughts. I didn't look back as I bolted down the stairs and out the door. When I reached my truck, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice. Finally, I got the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I started the engine and peeled out of there, gravel flying as I sped down the road. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there she was, standing at the edge of the driveway, her grin wider than ever. She was holding the package I delivered, cradling it in her arms like it was something precious. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers again, louder and clearer, like they were coming from inside my own head. I quit my job the next day. Whatever was in that house, whatever she was, it wasn't something I wanted to mess with. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that package, about who sent it and what might have been inside. And I wonder if it ever reached the person it was meant for, or if it was meant for me all along. My name is Chris, and I used to work at the post office in Timber Ridge, Colorado. It was a small town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. This story starts with what seemed like a minor mistake on my part, but it ended up ruining more than one life. It was a Thursday afternoon, one of those slow days where I spent more time sorting mail than dealing with customers. A package came across my desk with a smudged label. The ink had bled just enough that the house number wasn't clear, and instead of taking the time to double check, I made a quick guess. I sent it off and didn't think about it again. The next day, Gloria Parks stormed into the office. Everyone in town knew Gloria. She was retired, lived alone, and had a knack for turning small inconveniences into full-blown disasters. "Where's my package?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the hum of the office. I stood up, already bracing myself for the usual rant. "Let me check the system for you, Mrs. Parks. What was the address it was supposed to go to?" "You should know that already," she snapped, her cane tapping angrily against the floor. "I paid extra for tracking, and now it's lost." I looked up her tracking number, and sure enough, it had been delivered to the wrong house. The system showed it had been left at 214 Maple Street. Gloria lived at 241 Maple. My heart sank when I realized I'd flipped the numbers. "I think I know what happened," I said, trying to sound calm. "It was delivered to the wrong house. I'll head over there after my shift and get it back for you." She wasn't having it. "You'll get it back now," she shouted, slamming her cane onto the counter. I promised her I'd fix it, and eventually she left, muttering something under her breath about incompetence. But the look she gave me as she walked out, cold, almost calculating, stuck with me. That night, I went to 214 Maple Street to retrieve the package. It was a small house owned by an older man named Frank, who'd been living there as long as I could remember. He was polite when I explained the situation and handed me the unopened package without a fuss. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. When I returned the package to Gloria the next morning, she didn't say thank you. She just took it, stared at me for a moment, and muttered, "You'll regret this." I thought it was just Gloria being her usual self, but something about the way she said it gave me chills. The next week, things started to go wrong at the post office. It began with small stuff, letters showing up torn or packages that were inexplicably delayed. At first, we chalked it up to bad luck or a system glitch. But then the notes started appearing. The first one was left on Linda's desk. Linda was one of my coworkers, a sweet woman in her 60s who'd been working at the post office for over 20 years. The note was written in jagged, almost frantic handwriting and read, "You ruined everything." Linda was shaken, but assumed it was a prank. The next day, another note showed up, this time on Tom's locker. "Payback is coming." By the end of the week, all of us had received at least one note, except for me. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. Some of my coworkers thought it was Gloria. Others thought it was a disgruntled customer. Deep down, I had a sinking feeling it was about that package. One afternoon, Tom went out to his car after his shift and found all 4 tires slashed. A few days later, Linda's windshield was smashed with a rock. Whoever was doing this wasn't just leaving notes anymore, they were escalating. People started calling out sick or taking their breaks in pairs because no one wanted to be alone. The worst part was the guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all my fault. I didn't know how Gloria had gone from being angry about a package to targeting random people, but it felt like everything pointed back to me. I wanted to say something, to admit what I'd done, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. Then it got worse. One night, I stayed late to finish sorting the incoming mail. The office was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I was just about to lock up when I noticed something on my desk. A package wrapped in brown paper addressed to me. My stomach twisted as I picked it up. There was no return address. I thought about opening it right there, but something told me to wait. Instead, I drove home, the package sitting on the passenger seat, like a ticking time bomb. When I got to my apartment, I placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it for what felt like hours before finally tearing the paper away. Inside was a stack of photographs. Pictures of me, taken at work, at home, even on my lunch breaks. Some of them were recent, but others were older, ones I didn't even know existed. At the bottom of the stack was a note that read, "You know what you did." I barely slept that night. The next morning, I called in sick and spent the day looking over my shoulder, convinced that whoever was doing this was watching me. I didn't know how to stop it, and I didn't know who to trust. All I knew was that I had to confront Gloria. I drove to her house that afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I knocked on her door, there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and the door creaked open. "Mrs. Parks?" I called, stepping inside. Her house was eerily quiet. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks. I walked through the living room, my heart pounding with every step, and then I saw her. She was sitting in her armchair, completely still, her head tilted to one side. For a moment I thought she was asleep, until I saw the dried blood on her temple and the shattered glass on the floor beside her. Pinned to her chest was another note, written in the same jagged handwriting as the others. "You should have been first." I stumbled back, my mind racing. If Gloria was dead, then who had been targeting us? And why had she been killed? The police ruled it a robbery gone wrong, but I knew better. I quit my job the next day and left Timber Ridge a week later, unable to face my coworkers or the guilt of what I'd caused. To this day, I don't know who was behind the notes or the attacks, or if they're still out there, waiting. But sometimes late at night, I wake up to the sound of glass breaking or the creak of floorboards, and I wonder if they've finally come for me. I never wanted to be a manager. Let's get that straight from the start. My name's Tony, and in 1973 I was working as a postal clerk in Manhattan. The post office was chaotic back then. Stacks of letters and parcels everywhere, the smell of ink and paper thick in the air, and the constant hum of chatter, machines, and occasional yelling. It was the kind of job you took because you needed steady money, not because you had any great love for sorting mail. I wasn't the best employee either. I had a knack for taking shortcuts and shifting blame whenever something went wrong. A letter got lost, I'd claim it was the sorting machine. A package was damaged, probably the carrier's fault. I figured, what's the harm? It's not like the post office ever ran smoothly anyway. So when they called me into the supervisor's office one Monday morning, I was sure I was about to be chewed out for something, or maybe even fired. The promotion. Mr. Kowalski, my supervisor, was a wiry guy in his 50s who always looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown. He gestured for me to sit down without looking up from the stack of papers on his desk. The room smelled like stale cigarettes, and the overhead light flickered just enough to make my head hurt. "Tony," he said finally, setting his pen down, "you've been with us for, 7 years now?" "8," I corrected, unsure where this was going. He nodded, lighting a cigarette and exhaling a cloud of smoke that made me cough. 8 years. Long time. You've seen how this place runs, or doesn't run, half the time. I chuckled nervously. Yeah, I guess you could say that. Well, he said, leaning back in his chair, we're promoting you. Effective immediately, you're the new assistant manager for this branch. I blinked. What? Me? Why? Kowalski shrugged. You've been here long enough. You know the system, and we need someone to step up. I didn't argue. A promotion meant more money, and back then I was living paycheck to paycheck in a crappy one-bedroom apartment in Queens. I figured, how hard could it be? I just do what I always did, smile, nod, and pass the blame whenever things went wrong. The first week was manageable. Sure, the workload was heavier, but I had a desk now, and people actually listened to me when I gave orders. It felt good. For the first time, I thought maybe this promotion wasn't such a bad deal. But then the complaints started rolling in. It began with a missing shipment, several crates of mail destined for Long Island that never made it to the sorting center. The clerks swore they'd processed it, the carriers swore they'd never received it, and the customers were furious. Normally, this kind of thing would have landed on Kowalski's desk, but now it was my problem. I spent hours digging through records trying to figure out where the shipment had gone. Finally, I found the answer. The crates had been mislabeled and sent to the wrong depot, an error that could be traced directly to a form I'd signed off on without reading. I could already hear Kowalski's voice in my head. You're the manager now, Tony. Fix it. The system fights back. As the weeks went on, the problems multiplied. Damaged packages, incorrect deliveries, like delays in payroll. All of it landed squarely on my shoulders. At first, I tried to handle it the way I always had, by deflecting blame and making excuses. But this time, it didn't work. One day, a union rep showed up at my office. His name was Eddie, a burly guy with a permanent scowl who didn't mince words. You've got workers complaining about unsafe conditions, Tony, he said, crossing his arms. Broken equipment, missing safety protocols, people getting hurt on the job. What are you doing about it? I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't know, I stammered. Yeah, well, now you do, Eddie said, slamming a stack of reports onto my desk. And if you don't fix it, we're filing a grievance. I flipped through the reports, my stomach sinking. Most of the issues he mentioned had been brewing for years, long before I got the promotion. But now that I was the manager, it was my name on all the forms, my signature on all the approvals. Show my responsibility. The trap closes. The breaking point came on a sweltering August afternoon. The air conditioning in the building had been broken for weeks, and the entire staff was on edge. I was in my office, drowning in paperwork, when Kowalski walked in. He tossed a file onto my desk without a word. I opened it and immediately felt my blood run cold. It was an audit report, detailing years of systemic errors, missing inventory, falsified time cards, and countless other issues that had gone unnoticed or ignored. And every single one of them had been signed off by me. I didn't do half this stuff, I said, my voice rising. Most of these dates are from before I got promoted. Kowalski gave me a pitying look. Doesn't matter, Tony. You're the manager now. This is your mess to clean up. I realized then what the promotion really was. They hadn't given me the job because they thought I deserved it. They'd given it to me because they needed a scapegoat, someone to take the fall for decades of mismanagement. The final blow. That evening, I stayed late, combing through the audit report and trying to find a way to salvage my reputation. The office was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes every creak and rustle 10 times louder. As I worked, I heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. I glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. Hello? I called, my voice shaky. No response. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I stood up, my heart pounding. Who's there? The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the end of the hall. But when the lights steadied, the hallway was empty. I told myself I was just imagining things, that the stress was getting to me. But as I packed up my things and headed for the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find a letter on my desk. It was from the regional director, informing me that I was under investigation for negligence and misconduct. They were pinning the entire audit on me. Kowalski wasn't in his office. In fact, no one could tell me where he was. It was as if he'd vanished overnight, leaving me to face the fallout alone. By the end of the week, I was fired. They said I could appeal the decision, but what was the point? I'd been set up from the start. It's been years since that happened, and I've never set foot in a post office again. Sometimes when I walk past one, I feel a pang of bitterness, not just for what they did to me, but for the part I played in my own downfall. I took shortcuts, shifted blame, and thought I could get away with it. In the end, the system didn't just fail me, it swallowed me whole.